Part 2. Ains calmly studied Shaltir, who was bracing her spear at lance. He had to triumph in this melee if he was to attain victory. The back of her armor bulged out, and a pair of bat wings burst forth, as though going straight through the plates. Ains knew what would happen next. Several giant bats flapped out from behind her to the sky. These were elder vampire bats summoned through her household summon skill. In addition, she continued summoning vampire bat swarms. They were not strong monsters, but he could not let them do as they pleased. Ains cast a spell. Shark Cyclone. A tornado, 100 meters high and 50 meters from across, appeared before him. The black funnel cloud engulfed the bats before they could flee, trapping them within the vortex. Fast-swimming shapes could be seen within the rapidly spinning tornado. These creatures were 6-meter-long sharks, and they moved as though they were in the ocean. The desperately fleeing bats were like bait which had been dropped into the water, and the sharks sprang on them. This spell showed its true potency against flying creatures, and the proof of that was adequately shown as the sharks ripped the elder vampire bats limb from limb in an instant. Just as the vampire bats were vanishing after being torn apart, a shadow broke free of the tornado. It was a crimson shadow, bursting out of the tornado at top speed. The lance it thrust before itself left an after-image in the onlooker's eyes, like the fiery plume of a rocket. Ains could not react in time, and his body was racked with pain. It felt as though his bones were crumbling. In the instant in which Ains had failed to pay attention, Shaltir had appeared in front of him. Her cruel weapon pierced through Ains's chest and protruded out his back. Gawar. The weapon which had struck him also did bludgeoning damage, and the massive drop in health which resulted drew a cry of agony from Ains. Any pain which the undead Ains felt would cut out once its intensity exceed a certain threshold, much like his emotions did. This was why even Suzuki Satoru, who lacked combat experience, could endure this pain and calmly deal with it. That said, this was no ordinary pain. Ains's no, Suzuki Satoru's mind was assaulted by the fact that his life was ebbing away. His vision grew dim and he felt himself losing consciousness, as though he had lost a great deal of blood. However, Ains's will was stronger than that weak mind. This was because the person fighting here was not Suzuki Satoru, but the supreme ruler of the great underground tomb of Nazarick, Ains Urgaon. Shaltir did not cease her attack, even as Ains considered what steps to take next. Having impaled him with the tip of her lance, she continued driving it forward, ramming the point straight into Ains's body and forcing the thicker part of the lance behind it into him. He felt his body tearing apart, as well as a burst of intense pain, accompanied by the sensation of his health depleting further. Thus, Ains decided to activate the body of Effulgent Beryl. The green light which enfolded him shattered. The 10th tier spell, Body of Effulgent Beryl, reduced the effectiveness of bludgeoning attacks against its subject while it was in effect, and it could completely negate one instance of bludgeoning damage after it was cast. The Body of Effulgent Beryl absorbed the damage dealt by the lance, and so it seemed as though time had turned itself backward, the lance's tip retreating back outside Ains's body. Ains moved back to where he had been standing before the lance had impaled him. As Shaltir watched him in bafflement, Ains cast another spell. Wall of Skeleton. A wall composed of numberless armed skeletons erupted between the two of them. The skeletons in the wall attacked Shaltir, chopping, stabbing, and slashing at her. However, none of them managed to hit Shaltir's body. Maximize Magic, Force Explosion. An invisible shockwave exploded from Shaltir. The wall of skeletons buckled under the invisible impact, and then completely disintegrated. The pulverized chunks of bone pattered like rain as they fell. Still, it had bought some time for Ains, so it had been worthwhile. Release. In accordance with Ains's command, the triplet magic greater magic seal triggered 3 magic circles, each of which released 30 streaks of light, for a total of 90. These white bolts of light were non-elemental, magic arrows. The dazzling afterimage left behind as they traveled through the air were like the spread wings of an angel of death. First-tier spells could not breach Shaltier's magic defenses, but Ains had cast that spell anyway. Sensing something odd, Shaltier desperately tried to evade them, but the ivory bolts of light turned a full 90 degrees in mid-air and chased her down, falling on her like hail. The 90 magical bolts scored hit after hit on Shaltier, rapidly dropping her health. The reason why they could pierce Shaltier's defense was because Ains had used a skill to temporarily boost the magic arrows to the equivalent of 10th tier spells. Ains was not finished yet. Dance. Triplet magic. Obsidian sword. 3 long swords appeared in mid-air, their black bodies gleaming. They streaked after Shaltier, as though they had a mind of their own. "Out of my way!" Shaltier shouted as she batted him aside with her spear lance. However, the obsidian swords continued attacking her even after they were deflected. These weapons, created as they were through magic, were very difficult to destroy through physical means. Magic destruction. Shaltier used her scant few remaining MP to cast a spell which dispelled other magic. 2 obsidian swords vanished from that spell, cast with no regard to her remaining MP. However, one had not vanished, and it continued attacking Shaltier. The success rate of magic destruction was directly dependent on the spellcasting ability of its caster, and this was conclusive evidence of which magic caster was superior. Ah, how annoying! Shaltier paid no heed to the longsword attacking her and pressed onward to Ains. Damage like that was barely a scratch to Shaltier. The spear lance sent Ains flying to the side. With no way to resist bludgeoning damage now, Ains could not ignore this damage. He stabilized himself in mid-air with fly, and then... Damn it. This was the first time Ains had cursed in panic during this battle. Ains had enough health to weather an attack like that, but the problem was right before his eyes. This was because the health lost by Ains had been used to restore Shaltier's own health. Her recovery rate was enough to surpass the damage done by the obsidian sword, so in order to cut down her rate of healing, Ains cast an attack spell. Triplet Maximize Magic, Reality Slash. The 3-dimension rending slashes drew gouts of fresh blood from Shaltier, but she paid it no heed and continued pressing forward, the implacable obsidian sword at her back. Shaltier's depleted of MP, so all she can do is advance and fight within the effective range of the spear lance. Is that it? But that's the kind of fighting I hate most. Ains retreated with a fly spell, and continued attacking. Triplet Maximize Magic, Reality Slash. Even as he kept backpedaling, the distance between them shrank with each passing moment. This was the difference between the speed of a fly spell and a fly speed which had been augmented by skills. Shaltier pulled herself before him, spurting blood as she did. Then, she suddenly curled herself up. The air distorted and a massive shockwave erupted from Shaltier's body. That isn't a force explosion. That's an impure shockwave shield. The shockwave generated by the skill shattered the obsidian sword and smashed into Ains, sending him flying into the distance. Gawar. Perhaps the impure shockwave shield had been enhanced by another skill, but Ains ended up tumbling several times along the ground. By the grace of his fly spell and the magic items on him, he managed to force himself back upright. Perhaps it was because he lacked semicircular canals or because of his undead traits, but Ains was not dizzied by the rolling, and made to open the distance between himself and Shaltier. This was a fortunate consequence. Ains did not want to be locked in melee, and he now had a chance to cast other spells. Just as he was about to do so, Ains saw a ball of white light coalesce in front of Shaltia, which slowly shaped itself into a humanoid form. Ains was very aware of what that was. His unmoving face grew stiff, and in contrast, Shaltia grinned, like she had scored an overwhelming victory. "It's here. It's finally here, huh? I knew she'd use this sooner or later, but to think Shaltia would use Einherjar, her trump card, at this critical moment." The white light fully resolved itself into the shape of a person. If one ignored the bleached white armor and the glowing skin, it was the spitting image of Shaltia. Ains understood that the resemblance was not merely cosmetic. While it lacked Shaltia's spellcasting ability and several skills, and had no magic items, its weapons, armor, and stats were otherwise identical to Shaltia's. It was not undead, but a golem-like construct. The two creature types had nearly identical resistances and immunities. In other words, there was another Shaltia, who could only fight in melee combat. Ains had anticipated this would happen, but facing two level 100 opponents at the same time was still quite taxing. In addition, Shaltia had summoned countless minions, like wolves, bats, rats, and the like. These summoned minions were not as powerful as the Einherjar, but he could not discount their power in a group. "I could wipe them all out with an area effect spell. But what should I do about the Einherjar?" Just as Ains was thinking about his next move, the Einherjar charged, and that surprised him. Why was Shaltia not moving? Did she not intend to gang up on him? Ains learned the answer to those questions after shifting his line of sight. At the same time, the points of light in his eyes blazed up. "Now that's just unfair," Ains cursed. To think she would actually do something like that. What Ains saw was the sight of Shaltia's summoned minions disappearing one after the other, their bodies pierced by the Spirit Lance. Shaltia was killing her summoned minions with the Spirit Lance to restore her health. It went without saying that the amount of health restored by the Spirit Lance depended on the amount of damage it inflicted. When she attacked Ains, who was of equal level and had a high defense and her weak summons, it was immediately obvious which would give her more health in return. Indeed, Ains could see Shaltia's health refilling rapidly. The summoned minions steadily died and vanished. This was an unexpectedly cruel fact. Since friendly fire was in effect, this too should have been an expected outcome. Ains regained his calm, and altered his battle plans to take this unexpected development into account. However, Ains could not completely calm himself after witnessing someone killing their own summoned monsters to restore health, a sight which could not take place in YGGDRASIL. As a result, the charging Einherjar landed a solid hit on him. Gawar. The expressionless Einherjar continued attacking, the blows knocking Ains back. Forced back by the continuous string of attacks, Ains decided to use his own trump card. Shaltia's summons were not unlimited, so they should have been almost used up by now. Still, it would be bad to let Shaltia heal herself by using the surrounding monsters. The original plan was to use the trump card once the Einherjar appeared. That plan did not account for Shaltia healing herself by killing her summoned minions. Ains had 60 levels of job classes, and one of them was quite special. It was a class that was very rare even in YGGDRASIL, held only by a small number of players. Ains could enter this class because he was not fixated on pure power, but had instead focused on role-playing a necromancer to the hilt. Had he pursued character power, he would not have discovered this class, which required a very unorthodox build by chance. This was because the class's entry requirements were 5 levels of Overlord, a focus on necromancer-type job classes, as well as an overall character level of 95. In normal games, most people would spread the news of a newly discovered class on walkthrough sites to share with others. However, games like YGGDRASIL put a very high premium on information. For instance, few people would share news about a world-class item with others without charge. This was especially true for classes with trump cards. The class in question was called Eclipse. The class description stated, "Only an overlord who is truly dedicated to the pursuit of death may enter this class, which swallows up all life like an eclipse." The move Ains was planning to use was one which was only available after reaching the maximum level 5th, in Eclipse, a skill which could only be used once every 100 hours. It was the trump card of the Eclipse class. That skill was called "The Goal of All Life is Death." In that moment, a clock face appeared behind Ains, its hands indicating 12:00. Then, he cast a spell. Widen Magic, Cry of the Banshee. A woman's wail echoed through the air. This cry carried with it an instant death effect. Ains had used various skills to augment this spell, so its potency was greater than normal and harder to resist. Still, it was useless against Shaltir and the Einherjar construct. Oddly enough, Shaltir's summoned minions who had no resistance to instant death did not fall. This situation was quite bizarre, but Ains remained unmoved. Rather, one could say that things were going as planned. Tick. The clock face behind Ains ticked, and its hands slowly moved as the spell took effect. Ains glanced at Shaltir in the distance as his health dwindled under the onslaught of the Einherjar, and at the same time he felt quite disappointed. "So I can't finish this cleanly, huh? Damn you, Peroncino, did you build her specifically to counter me? To think you actually gave her a resurrection item. Damn it." Ains cursed his guildmate within his heart. Ains frantically struggled to avoid the attacks of the Einherjar. After 12 seconds had passed, the hour hand had completed a full circuit, and it pointed to the heavens once more. Then, Ains's trump card took effect. In that moment the world died. This was not metaphorical. Everything died. The Einherjar evaporated into white mist as it couched its lance, and dispersed before Ains's eyes. Even a homunculus with no concept of life died instantly. Shaltir's familiars shared the same fate, unable to resist the destruction which overtook them. That was not all. Even the air, which was not even alive to begin with, fell into death. For over 100 meters in all directions, the air was no longer breathable. If any living creature tried to respire within that area, their lungs would be corrupted by the deadly air, and they would die. Neither did the land escape the embrace of death. The terrain in a 100-meter radius was instantly transmuted into sand. Only Shaltir and Ains could move in this world, where only death remained. Ains's trump card, "The Goal of All Life is Death," strengthened the effect of instant death magic and skills. Thus augmented, those instant death effects could bypass any immunities or resistance and kill their targets after a certain amount of time had passed. One could resist it by using a resurrection effect on themselves within 12 seconds, as Shaltir had. The air and the land had also died because of that effect. In YGGDRASIL, the environment would not have succumbed, but in this new world, the effects were quite appropriate to the skill. All things were equal in the face of death. Ains himself was taken aback by this strange effect. The land had not died like this in YGGDRASIL. He could not help but shake his head after witnessing the effects of the game's powers in the real world. However, Ains swallowed back his surprise. The pride in his heart would not permit him to show any sign of shock. Instead, he acted as though this had been part of his plan. Carrying himself with the arrogance that befitted a ruler, he gently asked the sole survivor, What do you think, after experiencing the power that can slay even the unliving? The wind blew, dispersing the dead air between them. That wind carried his words to her. Incredible, I would expect nothing less of you, Ains-sama. My household summons are dead to the last. However, your MP is almost depleted, while my health is still at maximum. In Shaltia's eyes, Ains's MP was nearly zero. It was not completely gone, but he would probably only be able to use 2 or 3 more spells. With his MP so low, there was no way he could finish off Shaltia, no matter what spells he used. Not even that super tier spell, which could grievously damage the undead, fallen down, could do so. I believe you only have 2 more 10th tier spells in you? You had too much mana, so I can't really judge how many more spells you can cast. That's correct. I should only be able to cast about 2 more spells, I believe. That was not a lie. She had 1. Shaltia quirked up the corner of her mouth in a knowing smile. There was no longer any doubt that Shaltia Bloodvatlen was the victor and Ains-Ulgaun was the defeated. Shaltia patronizingly congratulated the loser, who had struggled so bravely until now. Truly magnificent. I had to deplete my MP and use up all my skills in order to drain your MP to that level, Ains-sama. You are to be praised for lasting this long. Shaltia tightened her grip on the spirit lance. Now, all that was left was to deliver the fatal blow in melee combat. You are correct. Thus, I shall humbly accept your praise. Shaltia's forehead twitched. She was very annoyed. She was very annoyed at Ains-Ulgaun's nonchalance. However, in the end Shaltia managed to swallow her rising uneasiness. No matter how she pondered the situation, Shaltia could not think of how Ains could turn the situation around. He had already used his ace in the hole. Thus, that was probably not composure, but the resignation of a death row convict, who had already foreseen his fate. Shaltia slowly closed the distance between them. Even if her enemy tried to cast a spell from a scroll, Shaltia was confident of being able to strike faster than him. Thus, there was no need to be hasty. Ains did not flee, but merely stood proud where he was. She could sense his determination from his stance, and so Shaltia asked, "Any last words?" "Well, since you felt that I was a disadvantage, that without my MP I would be nothing more than a mook. You came at me with everything you had. For that, I must thank you, Shaltia. If you had fought more carefully, things would not have gone so smoothly." Wah! Shaltia doubted her ears. It would seem she had heard some nonsense. Ignoring Shaltia's confusion, Ains continued evenly. The most crucial thing in PvP is to deceive one's enemy. For instance, pretending that you're vulnerable to holy elemental attacks when you're largely immune to them after swapping out your gear. On the other hand, there's the fact that you're still weak against fire elemental attacks. However, I seem to have miscalculated. I used false data, life, because I thought you would use life essence. It would seem that was a waste. If there is a next time, do remember to check your opponent's health. That's the difference between the theory and practice of tactics. This was not what Shaltia wanted to hear. Shaltia could not understand the meaning of those words. No, she did not want to understand them. He did not want to admit his defeat. No, she could feel his strong will. More than that, he sounded like victory was at hand for him. Shaltia continued closing the distance, but the thoughts welling up inside her checked her step. Why isn't Ains-sama backing off? As an arcane magic caster, he can't possibly beat me at this range. This must be a bluff. My friend Peroncino told me a great many things when he was making you. After I came to this world, I took the liberty of memorizing everyone's information. However, aside from my Black History, Pandora's actor, you are probably the NPC in Nazarick with whom I am the most familiar. Didn't you say you didn't know my skills? Ains smiled. I was lying, of course. Wasn't it obvious? I thought that perhaps if I said so, you would take the bait. That's because it would be quite hard to win if you saved your impure shockwave shield until the end. The flow of blood meant nothing to the undead, but Shaltia could feel hers stray from her face. In exchange, a wave of agitation spread through her entire body. That was not a lie. Nothing he was saying here was a lie. Ains Ulgaun was standing before her without running away because he was confident of uttering victory. Ah! Shaltia's lips parted and she wailed, the better to vent the emotions welling up inside her breast. Shaltia was the lion, Ains was the rabbit. She should have been a hunter. No, that was wrong. This should have been a battle between lions. It was just that Shaltia had treated him as a rabbit. The anxious and uneasy Shaltia clutched at her spear lance, intending to finish this battle right away, intending to kill her foe with strike after strike, even if he fought back. An instant before that, the spell Ains cast went off, and he reached into his robe. A clear, crisp sound rang forth. Shaltia could not help but doubt her eyes. This was impossible. The spear lance had bounced off some kind of white metal. If it had been deflected by magic, Shaltia would have pressed the attack, because she knew Ains did not have much MP left. That would simply have been his death throes. However, Shaltia froze as she beheld the scene before her. That pure white radiance was not the work of magic. It was from a suit of armor. It was a set of pure white armor, with a huge sapphire set into the breastplate, which radiated a pure, holy light. That suit of armor was on Ains's body, and it had repelled the thrust of the spear lance. From his superior height, Ains looked toward Shaltia. No. He was probably looking down on Shaltia. She was angry, of course, but Shaltia did not have the energy to spare on that, because a cold voice spoke to her. From the start, I too was planning to end this battle in melee combat. There was a loud bang as a hand struck the magnificent table, which shuddered from the blow it had taken. The guardians here had been watching the battle intently. They had struck the table several times, but this was the first time that particular person had done so. Impossible. That armor belongs to that supreme being. Touch me, Summer, is it? Albedo squinted at the crystal monitor as she breathed the name of that supreme being. Correct. That is Touch Me Summer's armor. Cositus seemed very excited. No, in truth, he was very excited as he exclaimed. The pure white armor which Ains wore belonged to one of the 9 people in YGGDRASIL who possessed the class of World Champion. Only the winner of the developer-sanctioned tournament could possess the class of World Champion, and the company awarded a special piece of equipment to the champion as a prize. Touch Me had chosen that suit of white armor. This specially made armor complemented his status as a world champion, and its abilities exceed those of divine class items, putting it on par with guild weapons. Of course, since it was a gift to the champion, only the world champion could equip it. However, by using the warrior transformation spell, Perfect Warrior, it would seem he is no longer bound by any job-related penalties, and can make use of warrior equipment. Demiurge's tone was filled with respect, and Albedo murmured in awe. To think his plans had been laid out that far in advance. Albedo broke out in goosebumps, and she hugged herself. By turning into a warrior via magic, one could equip several items that would normally only be usable through specific job classes. This was a method the developers had implemented to allow players without specific classes to make use of items such as shurikens, vajras, kata, and other bizarre pieces of equipment. However, it would seem that spells remit also extended to those prize items issued by the developers to world champions. Astounding. To think he actually thought that far aead am in awe. Though the battle had not yet been decided, the Guardians present were filled with incomparable reverence for Ainz's cunning and wealth of experience, which had allowed him to weave such an intricate plan and guide it to fruition. And as the Guardians watched the crystal monitor, their delight in all growing within them, the sound of the table thumping could be heard again. That is, again, Cositus raised his voice.